She fell asleep alone in an abandoned house high up in the mountains, convinced she would die there with the baby she carried in her womb. But when the morning sun pierced through the cracks of the broken window, Eleanor woke up to discover that someone had placed a blanket over her freezing body, and the smell of hot stew was wafting from somewhere in a house that should have been empty for decades. Can you imagine the sheer terror of waking up knowing someone watched you sleep all night long, and you don't know if that person came to save you or to harm you? But this story actually happened in November of 1938, high in the misty ridges of the mountains, in a place so forgotten that even the maps didn't remember it existed. If you are watching this story right now, drop a comment below telling me which city or country you're watching from. I read every single comment, and it makes me so happy to know these stories cross borders and reach so many different hearts. Now, come with me, and I'll tell you every detail of what happened to Eleanor, and I guarantee you won't forget this story anytime soon. Eleanor Carter was 19 years old when her life completely fell apart. She was the only daughter of Thomas Carter, a fabric merchant who became a widower when the girl was only 7. Her mother, Eulalia, died of childbed fever after a difficult delivery that also took the baby who would have been Eleanor's brother. After that, Thomas was never the same. The man who used to laugh easily and carry his daughter on his shoulders through the streets of Blackwood turned into a silent, bitter shadow. He raised Eleanor with military-like rigidity, believing that severe discipline was the only way to protect the girl from a cruel world. The house they lived in stood on the town's main street, a narrow 2-story building with the dry goods store on the ground floor and their living quarters above. Eleanor grew up amidst the smell of imported linens and the hum of Mrs. Higgins's sewing machine, the seamstress who worked for her father. She learned to read with the town preacher, had beautiful penmanship, and loved copying poems into notebooks she hid under her mattress. Thomas didn't approve of dreams. He said poetry was for idle folk, and that a woman needed to learn to be practical, not a dreamer. Eleanor obeyed in silence, but inside she harbored a whole world of secret hopes. She dreamed of a man who would truly love her, who would read poetry to her, who would make her feel she existed beyond the 4 walls of that cold house. And it was exactly this hunger for affection that made her easy prey when Arthur Vance arrived in town in March of 1937. Arthur was a lawyer coming from Chicago on business, staying at the boarding house for 3 weeks. He was 35, wore well-tailored suits, smelled of expensive cologne, had a rich vocabulary and calculated smiles. He walked into Thomas's store to buy linen, and that was where he saw Eleanor for the first time. The young woman was organizing bolts of fabric on a high shelf, standing on a wooden ladder, and when she turned to help the customer, Arthur looked at her in a way that made her heart race. He returned to the store 5 times that week. Always with elegant excuses. He needed more fabric, wanted to check measurements, had questions about quality. Thomas suspected nothing. After all, the man spent freely and paid cash. But Arthur wasn't interested in fabrics. He observed Eleanor with the attention of a hunter, measuring her every reaction, testing the ground. On the 5th visit, when Thomas went to the back room to fetch a roll, Arthur leaned over the counter and said softly that Eleanor had the saddest eyes he had ever seen, and that such a beautiful girl shouldn't be so sad. Those simple words were like rain in a drought. Eleanor felt something wake up inside her chest, a mixture of fear and excitement she had never experienced before. She didn't answer, just lowered her eyes, but Arthur saw the blush rise on her neck and knew he had won the first battle. From there he built his trap with diabolical patience. He started leaving notes hidden between the fabrics he bought, small folded papers with romantic phrases copied from famous poets. Eleanor would find those notes when she was alone in the store and read them with her heart beating out of rhythm. Arthur wrote that she was beautiful, that he couldn't stop thinking about her, that fate had placed them in each other's path. He never mentioned he was married. He never said he had a wife and 2 children waiting for him in the city. He never revealed that he did this in every town he visited for work, always choosing young, lonely women, always using the same techniques. Eleanor fell like a bird into a snare. She began to wait for the notes with painful anxiety, hiding every scrap of paper as if it were treasure, rereading those phrases until she had them memorized. Arthur noticed when she was completely hooked, and then suggested a meeting. He wrote that he needed to see her alone, just once, just to talk properly without her father around. He set it for a Sunday afternoon at the old abandoned chapel on the road to the Miller farm, a place no one had visited in years. Eleanor knew it was wrong. She knew a decent girl didn't meet a man in secret, but the loneliness of 19 years screamed louder than her conscience. She told her father she was visiting Mrs. Higgins, who was ill, and walked the 2 miles to the chapel with her heart in her throat. Arthur was waiting for her sitting on the stone steps with that smile that looked like a promise of happiness. He talked with her for hours. Spoke of life in the big city, the books he read, the places he knew. He asked about her dreams, listened with feigned attention, made Eleanor feel that finally someone saw her as a person, not as property or an obligation. When the sun began to set, Arthur held her hand and said he was in love, that he had never felt anything like this, that he wanted to marry her. Eleanor asked how, since they barely knew each other. He replied that the heart knows when it finds the right match, and that he would stay longer in town, find a way, speak to her father at the right moment. There were 6 meetings over the course of a month, always at the abandoned chapel, always in secret. Arthur increased the intimacy gradually, testing limits, advancing with patience. Eleanor resisted at first, but he used every weapon, said he loved her too much, that he couldn't bear just looking, that they were practically engaged, that God understood true love. The 6th time, on a warm afternoon in April, Arthur completely broke down her defenses. He promised marriage the following week, said he had already spoken to a priest in another town, that he just needed proof of her love. Eleanor gave in because she believed every word. 3 days later, Arthur left Blackwood, said he needed to resolve urgent matters in Chicago, arrange his life so he could return and marry her. Promised he would write every week, that he would be back in 2 months at the most. Eleanor waited for letters that never arrived. She waited weeks in growing agony, inventing excuses, telling herself something had delayed him, that he would return. She only understood the full truth when she realized her monthly cycle was late. The terror was like plunging into icy water. Eleanor waited another week, then 2, praying she was mistaken. But the signs didn't lie. Morning sickness, sore breasts, profound fatigue. She was pregnant by a man who had vanished without leaving an address, without leaving anything but empty promises. Reality was a brick wall slamming into her face. Eleanor tried to hide it for 3 months, wearing loose clothes, binding her belly with strips of cloth, avoiding her father. But in July, when she began to feel sick during dinner and retched at the table, Thomas finally realized the truth. What happened that night was an explosion of rage Eleanor had never imagined possible. Thomas, who had always been controlled even in his coldness, transformed into pure fury. He screamed, calling his daughter a tramp, a disgrace to the family, the murderer of her mother's memory. He demanded to know who the father was. Eleanor, weeping, told him about Arthur Vance, the lawyer from Chicago. Thomas stood in silence for a minute, as long as eternity, and then said a sentence Eleanor would never forget. "You were stupid enough to believe a man like that would marry a poor shopkeeper's daughter. He used you because you let yourself be used. Now carry the consequences." Eleanor begged for forgiveness on her knees, said she was deceived, that Arthur promised marriage, that she didn't know. Thomas replied that ignorance was no excuse, that she had brought irreparable shame to the family name, that he could no longer look at her without feeling disgust. Eleanor asked what she should do, where she should go. Her father said it wasn't his problem, that she chose to lay with a man before marriage, and now she had to deal with the consequences alone. Thomas gave her 3 days to leave the house. Said he didn't want to see her belly grow under his roof, that the neighbors must already be suspicious, that her presence was staining the store's reputation. Eleanor tried to appeal to any remnant of fatherly love, reminded him she was his only child, that she had no mother, that she had nowhere to go. Thomas turned his back and went up to his room. 2 days later, he put her few clothes in a bundle and left it at the street door along with $10, the equivalent of 2 months' wages for a maid. Eleanor took the bundle and the money with trembling hands. She was 19, 7 months pregnant, and had absolutely no place in the world to call home. She tried knocking on Mrs. Higgins' door. The woman opened it a crack, looked at Eleanor's belly with a mix of pity and fear, and said she couldn't help, that her husband wouldn't allow it, that she understood the situation. Eleanor tried 3 more houses. At all of them, she received versions of the same answer: silent pity and closed doors. No one wanted to associate with a disgraced girl. On the first night, Eleanor slept under the bridge by the Coldwater Creek, wrapped in her bundle of clothes. The July chill cut to the bone, and she spent the entire night awake, shivering, listening to the sounds of the water and nocturnal animals, her hands over her belly, apologizing to the baby who hadn't even been born yet. By morning, she made a desperate decision. She couldn't stay in Blackwood, where everyone knew and judged her. She needed to leave, go anywhere, find some place where she could hide until the baby was born. She began to walk along the road that wound up the mountain ridge, with no clear destination, just following the vague idea that perhaps there was some small town in the high country, some place where no one knew her story. Her father's $10 lasted only 3 days. She bought bread, milk, a thin blanket. After that, she came to depend on small kindnesses: a farmer who let her sleep in the barn, an old lady who gave her soup, a wagon driver who took her 10 miles. But as she climbed the ridge and the landscape became wilder, the farms became rarer, the people more suspicious of a pregnant woman walking alone. On the 5th day of walking, Eleanor was exhausted in a way that went beyond the body. It was a weariness of the soul, a weight that made every step seem impossible. She had developed sores on her feet. Her old boots weren't made for that kind of journey. Her belly weighed like stone, and the baby moved restlessly, as if sensing its mother's despair. Eleanor stopped at the top of a rise, looked at the landscape around her, and saw only endless mountains covered in dark pines, thick fog descending from the peaks, a grey sky promising rain. She didn't know where she was anymore. No map, no direction, no hope. That was when the pains started. False contractions that cut through her abdomen like knives, doubling her over in the middle of the dirt path. Eleanor breathed deep, trying to control the panic. She couldn't go into labor here, in the middle of nowhere, completely alone. The baby wasn't ready yet. There were nearly 2 months to go. She needed to find shelter, rest, calm her body. But where? There was no visible building in any direction, just trees, rocks, heavy silence. Eleanor kept walking because it was the only thing she could do. Every step was a negotiation with her own body, a plea to hold on a little longer. The sun was going down fast, the temperature dropping even further, and the fog becoming so dense she could barely see 10 feet ahead. It was almost by accident that she stepped off the main trail and began to climb a secondary path, almost invisible among the trees. Something that might have been a road decades ago, but was now taken over by weeds and loose stones. She climbed that path out of pure stubbornness, the contractions coming in irregular waves, her vision darkening at the edges. And then, Like an apparition rising from the fog itself, Eleanor saw the house. It was a structure of stone and timber, 2 stories, roof of pine shakes, surrounded by a small yard where tall grass mixed with wildflowers already withered by the coming winter. Broken windows with missing glass, front door ajar, creaking in the wind, clear signs of abandonment. But it was a roof, 4 walls, protection against the cold of the night that was arriving. Eleanor crossed the yard with difficulty, climbed the 3 stone steps of the porch, pushed the door which groaned on rusted hinges. The interior smelled of mold, rotting wood, years of solitude. But it was dry. There was a large room with a stone fireplace, a wooden staircase leading to the 2nd floor, floorboards covered in dust and dry leaves that had blown in through the broken windows. Remnants of furniture, a seatless chair, a table tipped on its side, what was left of a bookshelf. Eleanor didn't have the energy to explore. She let her bundle drop to the floor, dragged herself to a corner near the fireplace where the draught was weaker, and collapsed, sitting with her back against the cold wall. The contractions had subsided, but her whole body ached in a way she had never felt. She took off her boots and saw her feet covered in burst blisters and dried blood. Her hands trembled uncontrollably. She wrapped the thin blanket around her body, hugged her knees as best her belly allowed, and finally let the tears flow. Eleanor cried for everything she had lost. Cried for the mother she never really knew, for the father who rejected her with such coldness, for her own naivety that made her an easy victim of a lying man. Cried for the baby growing in her womb who would never have a dignified life, who would be born a bastard and carry that mark forever. Cried because she was hungry, cold, in pain, completely alone in a forgotten place at the top of the world. And cried because a part of her wished simply to close her eyes and not wake up anymore. Let the cold of the night take both lives at once, end that suffering before it got worse. Darkness took over the house when the last shred of light disappeared. Eleanor heard the sounds of the mountain around her, wind in the trees, creaks of old wood, some distant animal. She pulled the blanket up to her chin and curled up as tight as possible, trying to conserve any heat. The baby moved inside her, a pressure against her ribs, as if asking what came next. Eleanor placed her hand on her belly and whispered an apology. "I'm sorry for bringing you into this world, my child. I'm sorry because I won't be able to give you anything you deserve." She didn't remember falling asleep. It was more like fainting from pure exhaustion, the body simply shutting down to protect itself. The last conscious thing was the cold penetrating to her bones and the absolute certainty that she wouldn't survive until the next morning. But Eleanor woke up. And when she woke up, the first thing she felt was warmth. It took a few seconds for her brain to process that strange and unexpected sensation. Warmth. She was warm, not freezing as she should be. Eleanor opened her eyes slowly, the weak light of dawn entering through the broken windows, fog still dense outside, and then she realized there was a blanket over her that hadn't been there before. A thick blanket of dark wool, heavy, smelling of wood smoke. Her heart raced violently. Eleanor sat up too fast and dizziness hit her like a wave. She blinked, trying to focus her vision, looked around the empty room, and that was when she saw it. Beside her, less than 6 feet away, there was a tin mug steaming. Eleanor dragged her body to the object, took it with trembling hands. Stew. It was hot vegetable stew, with chunks of potato and carrot floating in the rich broth. Someone had placed a blanket over her while she slept. Someone had made hot stew. Someone was in that house. And that someone had watched Eleanor sleep for hours without her noticing absolutely anything. The terror that took over her was primitive and total. Eleanor let the mug drop, the stew spilling onto the wooden floor. She scrambled up, grabbed her bundle of clothes, began to walk toward the door with the desperate intention of fleeing there as fast as possible. It didn't matter where to, didn't matter the cold. She needed to get out before discovering who or what was sharing that house with her. But before she reached the door, a male voice came from somewhere behind her by the staircase. It was a deep, careful voice with a heavy rural accent. "No need to be scared," the voice said. "I ain't gonna hurt you." Eleanor turned slowly, her heart beating so hard she felt the pulse in her neck. And then she saw him for the first time. A man was standing at the foot of the stairs, half hidden in the shadows, as if afraid of startling her further with sudden movement. He was tall, broad-shouldered, wearing simple workman's clothes, dark hair a bit long, several days' worth of stubble. He had his hands raised to chest height in a posture of surrender, showing he held no weapon or threat. Eleanor couldn't speak. Her throat was closed with fear. She just stood there, clutching the bundle against her chest, trembling from head to toe. The man took a small step into the light, and that was when she could see his face better. He had light brown eyes, a thin scar crossing his right eyebrow, a tired expression of someone carrying an invisible weight. Not an old man's face, perhaps 30 years old, but he had marks of someone who had lived much longer than that. "I live here," he said, keeping his voice low and calm. "Not exactly live, but I've been staying here a few months. Reckoned the house was empty. Nobody comes up this high. When I got back from hunting yesterday evening, I found you sleeping in the corner. You were near froze solid. Put the blanket on, 'cause I thought you'd die of cold in the night. Made the stew this morning. Sorry if I spooked you, but I wasn't going to let a pregnant woman freeze in front of me." Eleanor finally managed to find her voice, though it came out hoarse and shaky. "Who are you?" she asked. The man hesitated for a second, as if deciding how much of the truth to reveal, and then answered simply, "Mick. My name's Mick Sanders, and you don't need to be afraid of me. I know I look a bit wild. Been a long time since I spoke to folks, but I swear on everything I won't harm you. If you want to leave, you can go, but you're real weak. You're with child. The cold out there will kill you today. Stay at least till you warm up, eat something, rest. Then you decide." Eleanor looked at him, trying to read intentions, searching for signs of lies or danger, but what she saw in his eyes was something unexpected: loneliness. That man was as lonely as she was, perhaps more. There was a deep sadness in him, something broken she recognized, because she carried the same thing inside herself. And there was sincerity in the way he kept his distance, how he spoke slowly so as not to startle her, how he waited for her decision without pressuring. She asked why he lived there, in an abandoned house in the middle of nowhere. Mick lowered his eyes to the wooden floor, and when he answered, his voice carried the weight of old shame. "I got nowhere else to go," he said simply. "Got out of the pen 6 months ago. Nobody gives work to a man with a past in prison. My family wants nothing to do with me. So I came up here, to a place where nobody knows me and nobody asks questions. Hunt, fish, survive. Ain't much, but it's what I got." That raw confession changed something in the air between them. Eleanor realized he was being honest in a way few people are, putting the ugliest truth first to give her every reason to run if she wanted. He wasn't trying to trick her or seduce her with half-truths. He was just being direct, and after months of being manipulated by Arthur Vance, that brutal honesty had a value she couldn't explain. Eleanor asked what he had been imprisoned for. Mick raised his eyes to hers, and there was a bitterness there that cut deep. "Theft," he said. 5 years in Blackstone Penitentiary for a theft I didn't commit. Worked as a carpenter in Chicago for a rich lawyer. He siphoned money from a client and pinned it on me. I was the hired help. Nobody took my word against his. Got convicted, served the time, came out with a stained name and a ruined life. That's it. I understand if you want to leave now." Eleanor felt something icy slide down her spine. Lawyer from Chicago. The chances were minimal, but she needed to ask. What was his name? She whispered. The lawyer's name. Mick furrowed his brow, not understanding why it mattered, but answered. Arthur Vance. Why? The whole world stopped turning for an eternal second. Eleanor felt her legs give way, and if she hadn't already been leaning against the wall, she would have fallen. Arthur Vance, the same man. The same devil who had destroyed two completely different lives, using lies and social standing as weapons. The coincidence was so absurd, it seemed like a cruel joke of fate. Mick noticed her reaction and took a step forward, genuine concern on his face. You know him? He asked. Eleanor nodded slowly, her voice coming out as a thread. He's the father of my child. Mick stood in silence for a long moment, processing that information. Then he closed his eyes, took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice was laden with a cold, controlled anger that Eleanor felt in her bones. That son of a bitch, Mick said. He promised he'd marry you, didn't he? Said you were the love of his life, that he'd leave everything for you, made you believe every word till he got what he wanted. And when you got pregnant, he vanished and left you alone to carry the consequences. Was that it? Eleanor nodded, tears sliding silently down her face. Mick ran a hand through his hair in frustration, walked to the broken window, looked at the fog outside. He does that, he said with a bitter voice. Met one of the maids at his house years ago, before everything went wrong. She told me he had a reputation for seducing young girls, always choosing the ones who were poor and innocent, always using the same tricks. His wife knows, but pretends she don't 'cause the marriage is a family arrangement. He's a predator, and men like him never pay for the dirt they do 'cause they got money and a name that protects them. Eleanor let herself slide down the wall until she sat on the floor again, hugging her knees. She was too exhausted to feel anger. She only felt a deep void where any emotion should be. Mick turned and looked at her with an expression that mixed pity and something else. Something like the understanding of one who knows what it is to be destroyed by someone powerful and have no recourse. He walked slowly to pick up the mug of stew Eleanor had dropped, left the room, and returned minutes later with another mug full of still steaming stew. He placed it on the floor beside her, at a respectful distance. Eat, he said without any pressure in his voice. You need strength. Afterward, you decide if you want to stay or go. But while you're here, I give you my word I won't hurt you in any way. We were wounded by the same person. That has to mean something. Eleanor looked at the stew, then at Mick, then at her own hands, trembling with hunger and weakness. She made the decision that would change everything. She took the mug and drank the stew slowly, feeling the warmth go down her throat and spread through her frozen body. Mick nodded, satisfied, grabbed his own bedroll from the corner where it was hidden, and said he was going for a walk so she could have privacy, that he would be back in the late afternoon. And so, without any formal agreement, without promises or expectations, two strangers broken by the same person began to share a roof in the most forgotten house on the high ridge. The first days were strange in a way Eleanor never imagined. She and Mick shared that house like two wounded animals would share a den, each respecting the other's space with almost exaggerated care, keeping a safe distance, communicating only what was necessary. Mick slept upstairs, in one of the rooms that still had a solid floor. Eleanor stayed downstairs, near the fireplace he lit every night before going up. He hunted during the day, came back with rabbits or quail, prepared the food in silence, left her portion in a clay bowl he found in the rubble of the kitchen. Eleanor observed everything with a mixture of gratitude and fear. Gratitude because that man was keeping her alive without asking for anything in return. Fear because she had learned the hard way that men do nothing for free, that there is always a hidden price waiting to be collected. She expected Mick to eventually demand something, make some insinuation, show his true intentions. But the days passed, and he continued maintaining that respectful, almost formal distance. Morning. Stew's hot. Going out hunting. Need more wood. Short, practical sentences, without forced intimacy. It was on the fourth day that Eleanor finally had the courage to explore the house properly. Mick had left early, and she took the chance to climb the wooden stairs that creaked with every step. The second floor had 3 bedrooms and a narrow hallway with broken windows looking out to the dense woods behind the house. The first room was empty, just peeling walls and a floor covered in leaves. The second had the remains of a rusted iron bed and a rotten wooden chest that crumbled when she tried to open it. But the third room was different. There, recognizable furniture remained, as if someone had left in a hurry and left everything behind. A bed with a moldy but intact mattress, a pine wardrobe with crooked doors, a nightstand with a stuck drawer, and on the wall, a framed photograph covered in dust. Eleanor wiped the glass with her dress sleeve and saw the faded image of a family. A man with a thick moustache, a serious woman in a high-collared dress, a boy of about 10 between them. All looking at the camera with that rigidity typical of old portraits. In the bottom corner of the photo, written in almost invisible ink, "The Sterling Family, 1918. Eleanor stored that information in her memory, so the house belonged, or had belonged, to someone named Sterling. She went down the stairs carefully and went to explore what was left of the kitchen in the back. There was a wood stove, rusted but still functional, fallen shelves, some cracked ceramic jars. It was while rummaging through that debris that she found a curious object, a small metal box buried under a loose floorboard. Inside were tallow candles, some rusty nails, a small pocket knife, and a rosary of wooden beads. She was examining the rosary when she heard Mick return. The sound of his heavy boots on the porch, the door creaking. Eleanor hid the box quickly, feeling guilty for touching things, though technically that house belonged to no one. Mick entered carrying 2 cleaned rabbits and a cloth sack with something heavy inside. He stopped when he saw Eleanor in the kitchen, and for the first time sketched something resembling a smile. "Exploring," he said. "That's good. This house is too big for just one person." Eleanor asked if he knew who the Sterlings were, the original owners. Mick placed the rabbits on the makeshift table and replied that he had heard stories in the nearest village, down in the valley, when he went down once to trade hides for salt. "Folks say this house was built by a rich colonel back around 1900 as a hunting lodge. His son died here in an accident a long time ago, and after that the old man never came back. Left it all abandoned, as if closing the house could close the grief too. Some folks say the place is cursed, that the dead boy's soul still wanders here, but I never saw nothing strange, just silence and loneliness." Eleanor felt a shiver run down her spine. The idea of sleeping in a house where someone died, especially a child, messed with superstitions she tried to ignore but were rooted deep in the religious upbringing she received. Mick noticed the change in her expression and added quickly that he didn't believe in hauntings, that the only ghosts that existed were the ones we carried inside our heads, the bad memories that wouldn't leave us in peace. That phrase echoed in Eleanor for a long time. That night, after eating roasted rabbit with wild potatoes Mick had found in the woods, they talked for the first time for real. Mick asked where she was from, how she had gotten there. Eleanor told the whole story, from the strict father, the dead mother, the suffocating loneliness in Blackwood, to the meeting with Arthur Vance and the destruction that followed. She told it without sparing details, without trying to play the victim, just relating the facts with the tired voice of someone who no longer has the energy to feel shame. When she finished, Mick stayed silent for a long time, staring at the flames in the fireplace. Then he began to tell his own story, and Eleanor understood that this was an exchange, one vulnerability answering another. Mick had grown up in Chicago, the son of poor immigrants who came to America dreaming of their own land, but ended up living in a tenement. Mick learned carpentry from an Italian master, had good hands for the work, made beautiful furniture. At 22, he got a job at Arthur Vance's house, building bookshelves, tables, renovating the library. Thought he was finally building a stable future. It was all an illusion that crumbled in a matter of weeks. Arthur was siphoning money from an important client, and when the scheme was discovered, he needed someone to blame. Mick was perfect. Young, poor, no connections, always alone in the house doing the work. Arthur planted evidence, forged documents, paid witnesses. The trial lasted 3 days. Mick didn't even have a decent lawyer, just an overworked public defender who barely looked at the case. The word of Arthur Vance, a respected lawyer married to a judge's daughter, against the word of a carpenter's son of immigrants. The result was predictable. 5 years in the state pen, one of the worst prisons in the state. Mick spoke of those years in a monotone voice, as if talking about another person. The overcrowded cells, the constant violence, the corrupt guards, the food that was barely food, the diseases that killed men every week. He survived by keeping his head down, doing carpentry work for the guards in exchange for minimal protection, avoiding the gangs that controlled the yards. When he got out, in February of 1938, he found out his parents had moved back to the old country without leaving an address, ashamed of their convict son. No one in the city wanted to give work to an ex-con. Doors closed one after another. Mick tried to start over in other towns, but his criminal record followed him like a shadow. Eventually, he gave up trying to fit into society and decided to simply disappear. Climbed the ridge, found this abandoned house, set up camp. Lived on hunting and fishing, went down to the village once a month to trade hides for basic supplies, avoided conversation. He was only 28, but felt 50. When he finished telling, he looked at Eleanor and said something that engraved itself on her. We were destroyed by the same person, but in different ways. You were deceived, 'cause you believed his lies. I was convicted, 'cause nobody believed my truth. In the end, it amounts to the same thing. We're here, in the middle of nowhere, trying to survive the ruins. That conversation changed something fundamental between them. It was as if, by sharing their wounds, they had established a foundation of trust that didn't exist before. In the following days, the dynamic of the house gradually transformed. They started eating together, no longer in uncomfortable silences, but talking about small and big things. Mick taught Eleanor about the mountains, the sounds of the animals, which plants were edible, how to read the signs of the weather. Eleanor told stories her mother used to tell, poems she memorized, memories of childhood before life turned grey. Mick started making small repairs to the house, fixing windows, patching holes in the walls, building basic furniture with wood he found in the forest. He made a chair for Eleanor to sit on while she cooked, a stool for her to rest her swollen feet, a sort of crude crib for the baby that was yet to be born. Eleanor watched him work with his skillful hands, turning pieces of wood into useful objects, and felt something strange grow in her chest, something she was afraid to name because it seemed impossible and dangerous. If you are enjoying this story, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to believe that fresh starts are possible. And stay until the end, because there is still a lot to happen. It was in mid-September that Eleanor realized she was getting too attached. She waited anxiously for Mick to return from his hunts, missed his voice when he stayed silent too long, paid attention to every detail, the way he furrowed his brow when concentrated, the rare but genuine smile that sometimes appeared, the gentle way he treated her, always offering the best portion of food, always asking if she was comfortable, if she needed anything. And this frightened her deeply. Eleanor had sworn to herself she would never trust a man again, never let herself be fooled, that her heart was permanently closed. But Mick wasn't Arthur. He didn't promise the moon and stars, didn't use pretty words void of meaning. He simply acted with a practical and silent kindness that was worth more than 1,000 promises. And perhaps that was exactly why Eleanor was starting to feel things she shouldn't feel for someone she barely knew, who was there only by circumstance, who had no obligation to stay when things got harder. One afternoon, while Eleanor was washing clothes in a bucket using water Mick had fetched from the creek, she felt contractions stronger than normal. They weren't false this time. She recognized the difference. The baby was getting bigger, heavier, pressing on everything inside. Eleanor dropped the laundry and sat in the chair Mick had made, breathing deep, waiting for the pain to pass. But instead of passing, another wave came, and another, and suddenly she realized something was wrong. There was dampness between her legs, but it wasn't urine. When she looked, she saw blood staining her skirt. The panic was instant and overwhelming. Eleanor screamed for Mick's name once, twice, 3 times. He was outside chopping wood and came running, axe still in hand, eyes wide with worry. When he saw the blood, his face lost its color. "What do I do?" he asked with a tense voice. "Is there something I can do?" Eleanor said she needed a midwife, someone who understood, that she didn't know if she was losing the baby, if she was going into premature labor. She knew nothing. Mick made a quick decision. Said he was going down to the village to get help, that he would return as fast as possible, that she should stay lying down and not move. Eleanor grabbed his arm tightly, eyes full of tears and terror. "Don't leave me alone," she implored. "I'm scared. If I die here alone," Mick interrupted, cupping her face with both hands, looking straight into her eyes. "You ain't gonna die," he said, with a firm voice that admitted no argument. "I won't let that happen. I'll be back before sundown with someone who can help. Trust me." He helped her lie down on the mattress he had brought downstairs, covered her with all the blankets, left water nearby, and then ran out. Eleanor lay alone, listening to his footsteps fade away, and then only the silence of the house and the sounds of her own irregular breathing. The contractions kept coming in waves, but the bleeding had slowed. She placed her hands over her belly and talked to the baby out loud, because the sound of her own voice helped control the fear. "Hang on, my little one, just a little longer. We're going to survive this too." The hours that followed were the longest of Eleanor's life. She alternated between painful contractions and moments of tense calm, always eyeing the door, waiting to hear Mick's returning steps. The sun began to descend, the afternoon shadows getting longer, the temperature dropping. Eleanor started thinking the worst. What if he couldn't find anyone willing to come up the mountain to help a stranger? What if he had been recognized as an ex-con and arrested again? What if he had simply taken the opportunity to flee the responsibility of caring for a pregnant woman in crisis? But then, when twilight was already dyeing the sky purple and gold, she heard voices outside. Mick returning, and someone with him. The door opened, and a woman of about 50 entered. Grey hair in a bun, simple calico dress, carrying an old leather bag. Behind her came Mick, sweaty and panting, as if he had run the whole way. The woman approached Eleanor with the efficiency of someone who has seen this 1,000 times. "I'm Mrs. Gable," she said. "Midwife for 30 years. Let's see what's happening here." "Mrs." Gable examined Eleanor with experienced but surprisingly gentle hands, asking questions about when the pains started, how much blood had come out, if the baby was moving. After a few minutes, she sat back on her heels and sighed with relief. "It ain't labor yet," she explained. "It's what we call threatened premature labor. The baby's agitated, wants out early, but we can hold it. You're too thin, too weak. Your body ain't ready to birth a child. Need good food, complete rest, no effort whatsoever. And you need to stop carrying so much weight on your conscience, because the baby feels everything the mother feels." Eleanor began to cry, more from relief than anything else. Mrs. Gable wiped her tears with her apron and said she would leave some medicine, herbal teas, to calm the contractions, and that Mick knew where to find her if they needed her again. Then the midwife turned to Mick, who was leaning against the wall with his arms crossed, and said something that made his face turn red. "You're taking good care of her, son. Whatever the story is between you two, you're doing the right thing. Keep at it." After Mrs. Gable left, Mick prepared the tea she had left and brought it for Eleanor to drink. She obeyed in silence, and then asked how much he had paid for the visit. Mick averted his eyes and replied that it didn't matter. Eleanor insisted. She knew he had no money, that he lived by hunting and bartering. "How much?" she repeated. Mick sighed, defeated, and admitted he had given his rifle to the midwife, the only item of value he possessed. Eleanor felt a pain in her chest that had nothing to do with contractions. "You gave your gun," she whispered. "How will you hunt now?" Mick shrugged, trying to look unconcerned, but there was tension in his jaw. "I'll manage with traps and snares," he said. "The rifle was good, but it ain't essential. You and the baby are more important." Eleanor couldn't answer because her throat was closed with emotion. No man in her life, not even her own father, had sacrificed something important for her. But here was Mick, a man she had known for less than a month, who owed her nothing, who had every reason to be bitter and selfish after everything he went through. Giving up the tool that guaranteed his survival to save her and a child that wasn't even his. It was in that moment that Eleanor admitted to herself what she had been avoiding for weeks. She was falling in love with Mick Sanders. It wasn't the kind of blind, intense passion she felt for Arthur, that illusion built on lies and empty promises. It was something different, deeper and more frightening. It was a feeling that grew slowly but firmly, built on actions and not words, on small daily kindnesses, on mutual respect and shared vulnerability. And this terrified her because she knew she couldn't ask anything of him, didn't have the right to expect him to feel the same, shouldn't put that weight on the shoulders of a man who already carried too many burdens. The days that followed were forced recovery for Eleanor. Mick forbade her from making any effort, insisted she stay lying down most of the time, brought all the meals, took care of her with dedication that bordered on excess. Eleanor protested, saying she felt useless, but he wouldn't yield. "You're growing a life," he'd say. "Ain't no work more important than that. Let me handle the rest." It was during those days of convalescence that Mick began telling stories from his time in prison that he had never told before. Hard stories about men he met, some who became more animal than human, others who kept their humanity against all odds. He told about old Jack, a man of 70 who had been in for 45 years for a crime he committed in his youth, who had turned into a sort of grandfather of the prison, advising the younger ones, teaching patience and dignity. It was old Jack who saved Mick from turning into an empty shell of hate. The old man used to say that prison could take the body, but only if the person allowed it to take the soul too. Mick told about the plans he made lying on his cement bunk, dreaming of the day he would get out, of the life he would rebuild. All those plans had crumbled when he found out the world outside had no place for him. But now, he said, looking at Eleanor in a way that made her heart speed up, he was starting to have plans again. Small plans, like finishing fixing the house, like building a coop to have fresh eggs, like planting a garden in the spring. Simple things that seemed impossible just months ago. Eleanor asked if he thought about staying on the ridge forever. Mick stayed silent for a while, poking the sticks in the fire, and then replied that it depended. "Depended on what?" Eleanor pressed. Mick raised his eyes and looked straight at her, and there was something there she couldn't decipher. "Depends on you," he said softly. "If you leave when the baby is born, ain't no sense in me staying here. This place only stopped being a prison when you arrived." The words hung suspended in the air between them, charged with meaning neither was ready to fully unravel. Eleanor felt her heart race, her breath catch. She wanted to ask what exactly he was saying, wanted to know if that was a confession or just a practical observation. But she was afraid of the answer, afraid of interpreting it wrong, afraid of ruining the delicate balance they had built. So she just said she had no plans to leave, had nowhere to go anyway. Mick nodded, and Eleanor saw relief on his face before he hid it by turning to stir the food. It was in mid-October that the first serious trouble appeared. Mick had gone down to the village to trade hides for flour and salt, carrying the traps he had set during the week. He came back in the late afternoon with a worried expression and bad news. He had heard conversations at the general store, men commenting about strangers asking for a pregnant girl who had run away from Blackwood months ago. One of them described Eleanor perfectly. Long brown hair, green eyes, 19 years old, 7 months pregnant at the time she disappeared. Eleanor's blood ran cold. Someone was looking for her, and she was absolutely certain who it was. Arthur Vance. The son of a bitch wasn't satisfied just abandoning her. He wanted to make sure she never appeared to stain his reputation. Mick confirmed her worst fears, saying the men mentioned that the person offering the reward was an important lawyer from Chicago, claiming the girl was a distant relative, that the family was worried, wanted to find her to help. Lies wrapped in respectable concern. Eleanor knew that method well. Arthur was creating a narrative where he was the generous savior trying to rescue a troubled relative, when in truth he wanted to silence her permanently. If he discovered where she was, if he showed up with hired thugs or bought authorities, Eleanor would have no defense. It was her word, a disgraced single pregnant girl, against his, a respected lawyer, married to a judge's daughter. She already knew who the world would believe. Mick sensed the panic growing in her and knelt beside the chair where Eleanor was sitting. "Nobody's gonna find you here," he said firmly. "This house is off any known path. Nobody comes up here except the occasional lost hunter. I didn't give no information about you. Didn't say nothing to nobody in the village. And even if someone starts asking questions, they're gonna run into the story of my past, gonna think I'm just another ex-con living isolated, won't imagine there's someone with me." But Eleanor couldn't calm down. "What if someone decides to explore the ridge?" she asked. "What if they see smoke from the chimney? What if they find tracks on the path?" Mick promised he would be more careful, that he would light the fireplace only at night when the smoke mixed with the fog, that he would cover their tracks, that he would set up makeshift warnings on the trails to know if anyone had passed. But the feeling of fragile safety Eleanor had built in that house was cracking. The situation got even worse 2 weeks later, when Mick returned from another trip to the village, with news that Arthur's men had gone up to some of the higher farms, asking questions, showing a sketch of Eleanor made based on descriptions. The farmers were talking, creating theories. Some thought the girl had died in the mountains, frozen or attacked by animals. Others said she had managed to reach another town on the other side of the range. No one mentioned the abandoned Sterling house because no one remembered it existed. But it was a matter of time until someone thought to check even the most unlikely places. Eleanor made a decision that night. Told Mick that perhaps it was better for her to leave, try to cross to the other side of the ridge before she got too big to travel, before the baby was born and made her completely immobile. Mick looked at her as if she had gone crazy. "Leave to go where?" he asked with a tense voice. "Alone, 8 months pregnant, no money, not knowing the way. You won't last 2 days. Eleanor replied that at least this way she wouldn't put him at risk, that he didn't deserve to be dragged into her problems. That was when Mick lost his patience for the first time since they met. He stood up abruptly, walked to the window, ran his hands through his hair in frustration. When he turned back, his eyes were shining with an intensity Eleanor had never seen. "Stop it," he said with a hard voice. "Stop deciding alone what's best for me. I ain't fragile. I don't need protection. And I surely ain't gonna let you walk out of here to die alone on the ridge, 'cause you think you're being noble. If Arthur's men show up here, we deal with it. Together. Eleanor felt tears running down her face. "Why are you doing all this?" she asked with a broken voice. "You don't owe me anything. I'm just another idiot victim of the same man who destroyed your life. Why do you care?" Mick came back, knelt in front of her again, took her hands in his. And when he spoke, his voice was charged with an emotion that made the whole world stop. "Because when I look at you, I see someone fighting to survive against everything and everyone. And that reminds me that I can fight too," he said. "Because you made me remember that there's still goodness in the world, that there's still a reason to wake up in the morning. Because for the first time in 5 years, I don't feel alone anymore. And because—" He hesitated, took a deep breath, and continued. "Because I care about you in a way I didn't expect, didn't plan. That's probably the worst idea considering the circumstances, but it's the truth. I care about you, Eleanor. And I'm gonna protect you and this baby with everything I got, even if it ain't much." The silence that followed was dense with things unsaid, with truths finally laid out in the open, with feelings neither knew how to handle. Eleanor squeezed his hands back and whispered that she cared about him too, that she never imagined it was possible to fall in love for real after everything she went through. But it was happening, and she didn't know how to stop it anymore. Mick closed his eyes for a second, as if storing those words in some safe place inside his chest, and then pulled her into a careful hug, respecting the large belly between them. They stayed like that for a time that seemed infinite, and at the same time too short, just holding each other, feeling each other's warmth, building a silent promise that they would face whatever came together. And in that moment, in the abandoned house at the top of the ridge, with all the dangers of the world waiting outside, Eleanor felt something she hadn't felt since before everything fell apart. Hope. But fate hadn't finished testing them yet. 3 days later, on a cold November morning, when Mick was checking the traps near the creek and Eleanor was washing dishes in the basin, she heard sounds of horses and male voices coming from the trail. Her blood froze. She dropped everything and went into the house as fast as her enormous belly allowed, bolted the door, hid behind the makeshift wardrobe Mick had built. Through the cracks of the boarded window, she saw 3 men on horseback stopping in the front yard. They didn't look like local farmers, wore fine clothes, carried guns on their hips, thoroughbred horses. The one who seemed to be the leader dismounted and walked to the door, banged 3 times hard. "Is there anyone in there?" he shouted. "We know this house ain't as abandoned as it looks. Just want to talk." Eleanor held her breath, prayed that Mick wouldn't appear now, that they would leave thinking they were mistaken. But then the man shouted something that made her heart stop completely. "Arthur Vance sent us to look for a pregnant girl. She's his kin, going through hard times. He wants to help, wants to take her to a safe place where she can have the baby with doctors, good food, comfort. If she's here, just come out, and we settle everything nice and easy. Nobody gets hurt." Lies smooth as sugared poison. Eleanor knew exactly what awaited her if she went out. She would be taken to some isolated place, disappear along with the baby. Arthur would pay the men well and never think about it again. She pressed her lips together not to make a sound, even when she heard the men start to force the door, even when she heard the wood groan under their weight, trying to break it down. That was when Mick's voice cut the air from behind them. "That's private property," he said with an icy, dangerous tone. "Get out of here now." Eleanor dragged herself to the side window and saw Mick standing at the edge of the woods, without any weapon, but with the posture of someone who won't back down. The 3 men turned to him, and the leader laughed with scorn. "And who might you be?" he asked. "The runaway's boyfriend?" Mick didn't answer, just stood in a heavy silence that somehow was more threatening than any word. One of the men recognized Mick. "I know you," he said, voice loaded with disgust. "You're that carpenter who robbed his boss and went to the pen. What a coincidence, you being here protecting the girl Mr. Vance is looking for." Mick kept his expression neutral, but Eleanor saw his jaw tighten. The leader of the group smiled like someone who just drew a winning card. "So that's how it is, huh? Ex-con kidnapping a vulnerable girl? Reckon we're going to have to take both of you to the sheriff." Mick took a step forward, and there was something in his eyes that made even the armed men hesitate. "This girl wasn't kidnapped," he said, with a low, controlled voice. "She came up here running from the same bastard who destroyed my life, and I'll die before I let you take her to that son of a bitch to finish the job." The men exchanged glances, and Eleanor saw the leader give a subtle signal. They were going to use violence. They were going to attack Mick, invade the house, and there was nothing either of them could do to stop it. That was when a fourth horse appeared on the trail, and mounted on it was someone Eleanor never imagined she would see again, Mrs. Gable, the midwife. The woman, dismounted with agility impressive for her age, walked straight into the middle of the confrontation. "What are you men doing on the Sterling property?" she asked with an authoritative voice that didn't match her simple appearance. The leader started to explain about looking for a runaway girl, but Mrs. Gable interrupted him. "I know the girl you're looking for," she said loud and clear. "She's under my medical care, high-risk pregnancy, and she ain't running from nobody. She's seeking refuge, which is different. And this young man here," she pointed to Mick, "has taken better care of her than any blood family ever did. So if you got a problem with that, you're going to have to go through a respected midwife who delivers for half the families in this region, including the sheriff, the preacher, and Colonel Ambrose Sterling, owner of these lands." The colonel's name changed the atmosphere completely. The men looked at each other nervously. Mrs. Gable continued, implacable. "I suggest you go back to Chicago and tell Mr. Arthur Vance that the girl is in good hands, is being cared for, and when the baby is born and she's recovered, she'll decide for herself what to do with her life. Until then, any attempt to force contact will be seen as harassment and violence against a vulnerable woman, and I got very well-placed friends who won't like that one bit." The men hesitated, clearly not expecting to find organized resistance. The leader tried to argue once more, but Mrs. Gable cut him off with a direct order to leave before she called people who wouldn't be so polite. Eventually, with grumbles and threatening looks, the three mounted their horses and went down the trail. But before disappearing, the leader shouted that this wasn't over, that Mr. Vance would know that there would be consequences. When the sound of the horses finally dissipated in the distance, Eleanor came out of the house on wobbly legs. Mick ran to her, held her before she collapsed. Mrs. Gable approached with a serious expression. "I stopped by because I dreamed you were in danger," she said as casually as if commenting on the weather. "I've got the sight a bit. Things run in my veins, science don't explain. And turns out I dreamed right. Your situation is worse than I thought." The midwife entered the house with them and got straight to the point. "You ain't safe here anymore," she said. "Those men will come back, maybe with more folks, maybe with the law if Vance bought 'em. And when they come back, talking won't solve it." Eleanor asked what they should do then, where they could go. Mrs. Gable thought for a moment, and then made a risky suggestion. "There's one person who can help you," she said. "Colonel Ambrose Sterling, the owner of this land. He's a hard man, bitter since he lost his only son right in this house 15 years ago. But he's also a man of honor, the old school kind. If you tell him the truth, if he decides to protect you, nobody will have the guts to mess with you. He's powerful, got connections, is respected. But there's a problem. He ain't never been back here since his boy died. Can't stand to even hear mention of this place. Convincing him to get involved is going to be nigh impossible." Mick asked how they would go to the colonel if he didn't even come up to his own property. Mrs. Gable replied that the colonel lived at the main ranch 10 miles down the mountain and that she could arrange a meeting, but they would have to go in person, would have to convince him face to face. It would be risky because Mick would have to go down and expose himself, but it was the only chance they had to get real protection against Arthur Vance. Eleanor and Mick exchanged long looks, the silent communication of two who have already learned to understand each other without words. It was a huge risk, but staying there waiting for the thugs to return was simply waiting for defeat. Eventually, they agreed. Mrs. Gable said she would arrange everything, that she would return in 2 days to get them, that they should prepare to make the most convincing speech of their lives, because everything would depend on touching the heart of a man who for 15 years had closed his chest to any emotion. After the midwife left, Eleanor and Mick sat next to each other on the porch, watching the sun go down behind the distant peaks. Eleanor's belly was enormous now. The baby would be born in a matter of weeks. Mick placed his hand over the mound and felt a strong kick. "That one there's going to be a fighter," he said with a sad smile. "Just like the mama." Eleanor covered his hand with hers. "Just like the father I chose for it," she answered softly. Mick turned to her with watery eyes. "When this all passes," he said with a raspy voice, "when the baby comes and we get some safety, I want to do the right thing. I want to marry you for real in a church with witnesses. I want to give my name to this child. I want to build a life with you, however humble it might be. If you'll have me." Eleanor felt her heart explode in her chest. She turned, held his face with both hands, and for the first time since they met, she kissed him. It was a kiss salty with tears, soft and deep, sealing a promise that no document could make more real. When they separated, both were crying. But they were tears of hope, not despair. They had found each other in the worst possible moment of the worst imaginable circumstances, and against all odds, they had built something true and strong enough to be worth fighting for. Now, they just needed to survive what lay ahead. And in an abandoned house high on the ridge, two broken hearts finally began to become one. Mrs. Gable returned 2 days later at dawn, riding a sturdy bay horse and bringing a gentle mare tied by a rope. She had secured the meeting with Colonel Ambrose Sterling for that same afternoon, and the serious expression on her face made it clear there was no more time to lose. Arthur's men could return at any moment, and this time they would bring reinforcements. The window of opportunity was closing fast. Eleanor went down the mountain, sitting sideways on the mare, with Mick walking alongside, holding the reins, one hand always ready to support her if she lost her balance. Her belly was so big that any movement was uncomfortable, and false contractions came and went in irregular waves that made her hold her breath. Mrs. Gable went in front, guiding them through trails only she knew, shortcuts that saved hours of walking. The morning fog still covered the trees like a white shroud, muffling all sounds beyond the clop of hooves and everyone's heavy breathing. It took 3 hours to reach the Sterling main ranch. It was an immense property occupying a whole valley between 2 mountains, with pastures where hundreds of head of cattle scattered like dark dots on the green grass. The main house was an imposing structure of stone and wood, 2 stories with wide verandas, a roof of red tiles, well-kept gardens surrounding the main entrance. Everything there breathed old money and power, consolidated through generations. 3 ranch hands appeared when they saw the group approaching, hands near the guns on their belts, faces suspicious. Mrs. Gable announced herself with a firm voice, said she had an appointment with the colonel, that he was waiting. The men hesitated, exchanged glances, but eventually one of them went to the house while the others kept watch. Eleanor felt the weight of the curious and judging stares. She knew how she must look, a young pregnant woman without a ring, accompanied by a man looking like a fugitive in patched clothes. Everything about her screamed scandal and disgrace. The ranch hand returned and made a brusque gesture for them to follow. They dismounted in the yard and climbed the steps of the main porch. The door was open, revealing a dark and cool interior with heavy dark wood furniture, Persian rugs faded by time, portraits of serious ancestors on the walls. An elderly servant in a black vest guided them down a hallway to a study at the back of the house. Colonel Ambrose Sterling was sitting behind a rosewood desk, leafing through papers with reading glasses balanced on his aquiline nose. He raised his eyes when they entered, and Eleanor felt the impact of that gaze like a physical shock. He was a man of about 60, hair completely white, thick mustache, face marked by deep wrinkles of someone who spent decades under the sun and wind. But it was the eyes that impressed, grey as stone, cold as ice, carrying the weight of ancient sadness transformed into hardness. The colonel dismissed the servant with a gesture and indicated the chairs in front of the desk. "Sit," he said with a deep voice that brooked no disobedience. Mrs. Gable introduced Eleanor and Mick, explained the situation quickly. Pregnant girl fleeing a powerful man who deceived her and was now hunting her. Ex-convict wronged by the same man. The two refugees in the abandoned house up high. The colonel listened to everything without interrupting, without changing expression, only his eyes narrowing slightly when Mrs. Gable mentioned where they were living. When the midwife finished, the colonel stayed silent for a time that seemed infinite. Then he turned to Mick and asked directly, "You were imprisoned because of Arthur Vance?" Mick nodded and replied yes, that he worked as a carpenter for the lawyer, was falsely framed for embezzlement he didn't commit, spent 5 years in the state pen for another man's crime. The colonel asked why he should believe him. Mick looked straight into the old man's eyes and said he had no way to prove his innocence, that he had already learned that the truth often doesn't matter when you have no power or money, that he could only give his word, and understood if that wasn't enough. That raw honesty seemed to touch something in the colonel. He then turned to Eleanor and asked how she had met Arthur. Eleanor told everything, hiding nothing, without trying to play the innocent victim. Told about the loneliness, how easy it was for an experienced man to manipulate a naive girl, about the promises of marriage, the abandonment, the rejection by her father, the desperate walk through the mountains. When she finished, tears were sliding silently down her face, but her voice was steady. The colonel leaned back in his chair and took off his glasses, cleaning the lenses with a linen handkerchief, while he thought. "You are living in the house that belonged to my son," he said finally, and there was an old pain in those words that cut like glass. "He died there 15 years ago, hunting accident. He was only 23. He was all I had. After he was gone, I locked that house and swore never to go back, left it to the ghosts." Eleanor felt her heart squeeze, apologized for invading property that carried such painful memories. But the colonel raised a hand, silencing her. "It isn't trespassing when the place was empty," he said, "and perhaps it is even fitting that the house which held so much grief now shelters 2 people trying to survive. My son would have liked that. He was too soft for the world we live in, had a kind heart I never understood, but he would help you without thinking twice." The silence that followed was heavy with hope and fear mixed. The colonel put his glasses back on and looked at Mick with an intensity that pierced. "I know of Arthur Vance," he said. "Not personally, but I know the type. Men like that think they are untouchable because they always have been. They use the law as a weapon when it suits them and ignore it when it doesn't. And you are right, his word will always be worth more than yours because the world works that way. Unjust but real." Mick nodded, jaw tight. The colonel continued. "But I also have power in this region. I have a name, I have influence, I have debts that important people owe me. If I decide to protect you, Arthur Vance will have to back down or face a confrontation he won't want. The question is, why should I do this? What do you represent to me other than potential trouble?" It was Eleanor who answered, and the words came from the heart without filter or calculation. "Because we're just asking for a chance to live," she said with a choked voice. "A chance to raise this child in peace, to build a humble but dignified life, not to be destroyed by someone who already has everything but still wants to take even the little we managed to get. I know we have nothing to offer in return, no favors, no riches. But you lost a son who had a kind heart. By helping us, maybe you're honoring his memory." The colonel closed his eyes for a moment, and when he opened them again, there was something different there, a crack in the armor of ice. He stood up slowly, walked to the window overlooking the fields, stood staring at the vastness of the property. "My son was named Theodore," he said with a low voice. "He died because I pushed him to be something he wasn't. I wanted him to be hard, strong, capable of commanding all this when I was gone. But he was gentle, liked books and music, cared too much about people. I thought that was weakness. In the last argument we had, before he went on that fatal hunt, I told him he was a disappointment, that he wasn't worthy of the sterling name. He left here with those words in his ears, and never came back alive." The colonel's voice broke on the last sentence. Eleanor saw the old man's broad shoulders tremble slightly and realized she was witnessing something rare. That man of stone was crying in silence, decades of pain and guilt finally finding an exit. "I spent 15 years wishing I could turn back time," continued the colonel without turning around, "wishing I could tell my son I was wrong, that his kindness wasn't weakness, it was the best part of him. But the dead don't hear apologies." He turned back to them, and his face was wet. "But perhaps the living can be helped," he said. "You will stay in that house. I will legalize the situation, transfer the deed to your names when the child is born. I will spread the word that you are under my protection, and no one in this region will dare interfere. As for Arthur Vance and his men, I will send a very clear message. If he or any thug of his steps on my land again, there will be a confrontation involving lawyers and authorities I've known for 50 years. He will have to weigh if an inconvenient girl is worth creating a powerful enemy." Eleanor couldn't hold back the tears. She stood up stumbling and tried to approach to thank him, but a strong and sudden contraction hit her like lightning, making her double over and moan in pain. Mick and Mrs. Gable ran to support her. The midwife lifted Eleanor's skirt and saw liquid running down her legs. "Water broke," she said with an urgent voice. "Baby's coming right now." The colonel acted with military efficiency, shouted orders for the servants to prepare a room, bring hot water, clean sheets, towels. Eleanor was taken to one of the guest rooms on the second floor, a spacious room with a large four-poster bed, windows open, letting in midday light. Mrs. Gable took total command, organizing everything with experienced hands, ordering everyone out except Mick, who refused to leave Eleanor alone. The contractions were coming hard and fast now, without the long intervals of normal labor. Mrs. Gable examined and cursed softly. "Baby's in a hurry," she said. "Coming in a bad position, Breach. It's going to be a hard birth. Eleanor, you're going to have to be strong now more than ever in your life." Eleanor tried to answer, but another contraction silenced her, pain exploding through her whole body like liquid fire running in her veins. The hours that followed were hell on earth. Eleanor never imagined pain could be so absolute, so consuming. It was as if her body was splitting in half from the inside out. She screamed, cried, begged for it to stop, but Mrs. Gable was implacable, ordering her to push, to breathe, not to give up now. Mick held her hand so hard his knuckles turned white, whispering words of encouragement she could barely hear over her own suffering. Mrs. Gable had to perform a maneuver to turn the baby, pushing from the outside of the belly while Eleanor roared in pain. Blood. There was a lot of blood staining the white sheets. The midwife kept her expression controlled, but Mick saw the fear hidden in her eyes. The situation was becoming dangerous. If the baby didn't come out soon, if the bleeding didn't stop, both mother and child could die there. That was when Eleanor felt something change inside her, a sensation of tearing, followed by sudden relief of pressure. The baby had finally turned. Mrs. Gable shouted for her to push with everything she had. Eleanor obeyed, gathering strength she didn't know she possessed, pushing until she saw stars dancing in her vision, pushing until she felt she would faint. And then, in a moment that seemed suspended between life and death, the baby came out in a rush of blood and fluid. The cry that filled the room was the most beautiful sound Eleanor had ever heard, a strong, angry cry full of life. Mrs. Gable cleaned the baby quickly, cut the cord, wrapped the little one in a clean blanket. "It's a girl," she announced with a tired smile. "A beautiful and perfect girl. Got good lungs. Look at the racket she's making." Mrs. Gable placed the baby in Eleanor's arms, and the whole world disappeared. Eleanor looked at that little red and crumpled face, the tiny eyes shut tight, the little mouth open in a cry of protest, and felt love so intense it hurt more than all the contractions combined. It was her daughter. Her daughter who had survived against all odds, who had chosen to live even when everything conspired to the contrary. Mick was crying openly, looking at Eleanor and the baby with an expression of total wonder. He touched the child's face with a trembling finger, and the little girl grabbed his finger with surprising strength. That simple gesture broke something in Mick. He leaned down, kissed Eleanor's forehead, then kissed the baby's little head, and whispered promises that were prayers. "I'm gonna protect you both with my life. Gonna work till the bone to give the best I can. You two are my family now, my real family." Mrs. Gable was still working, expelling the placenta, stopping the hemorrhage, stitching tears. It took another 40 minutes until she declared Eleanor was out of danger. "You lost a lot of blood," said the midwife, "but nothing rest and good food won't cure. You're strong, girl, stronger than I imagined. Baby's a fighter too, born small but healthy, gonna grow up sturdy." When Mrs. Gable finally let Eleanor and the baby rest and left the room to wash her hands, Colonel Sterling was waiting in the hallway. The old man had heard everything, the screams, the crying, the birth. He asked if mother and child were well. Mrs. Gable nodded and said yes, they had been lucky. It could have ended much worse. The colonel asked to see. Mrs. Gable returned to the room and asked Eleanor if she accepted a visitor. Eleanor, exhausted but radiant, said yes. The colonel entered slowly, like someone entering a holy place, hat in hands, in a posture of respect unusual for such a powerful man. He approached the bed and looked at the baby, who now slept peacefully in her mother's arms. The colonel's hard face transformed completely. He extended a finger, and the little girl grabbed it, even in her sleep. "Theodore did that," whispered the old man with a choked voice. "When he was born, he grabbed my finger just like that, as if he knew he needed to hold us here in this world." Eleanor felt tears run down her face. She asked if the colonel would mind if she named her daughter in honor of him, not Theodore because it was a girl, but Theodora. The colonel looked at her with an expression of total shock, and then began to weep again, that man of stone finally melting completely. "It would be an honor," he said with a broken voice. "An honor I do not deserve, but will carry with gratitude until the end of my days." The colonel bowed, kissed the baby's forehead with grandfatherly tenderness, and left the room quickly, unable to contain the emotion overflowing. Mrs. Gable smiled and told Eleanor she had just gained the most powerful protector she could have in the region. That old man had a locked heart for 15 years. They managed to open it again. Eleanor spent 3 days at the colonel's ranch, recovering strength, learning to nurse with Mrs. Gable's help, letting her body heal from the trauma of birth. Mick stayed by her side every minute he could, caring, bringing food, changing the baby when she needed, learning to be a father even without having had any good model in his own life. Little Theodora was a calm child who nursed well and slept long periods, as if instinctively knowing she needed to make things easy for her exhausted parents. It was on the fourth day that an unexpected party arrived at the ranch. 5 men on horseback, led by someone Eleanor recognized instantly, even without ever having seen a photo. Arthur Vance in person. He had come down to the country to resolve the problem personally, tired of the incompetence of his hired hands. He was a man handsome in a studied way, expensive clothes, thoroughbred horse, posture of someone used to getting what he wants. But there was something in his eyes, a predator's coldness, that Eleanor hadn't been able to see months ago when she was blinded by loneliness. The colonel went to meet them alone, and the conversation happened in the front yard, where everyone could see, but not hear. Mick was by Eleanor's side at the bedroom window, watching tense, a protective arm around her. They saw Arthur speak with broad gestures, likely weaving lies about a worried relative, about family responsibility. Saw the colonel listen in silence, arms crossed, expression unreadable, and then saw the colonel answer something short and direct that made Arthur straighten in the saddle, face turning red with rage. The discussion intensified. Arthur shouted something about laws, rights, consequences. The colonel didn't raise his voice once, but his body language was threatening even from a distance. He pointed to the gate in a clear order to leave. Arthur hesitated, clearly not used to being dismissed like that. He tried to argue once more, but the colonel made a gesture and 10 ranch hands appeared from the shadows, all armed, all positioned in a semicircle around the visitors. The message was crystal clear. Leave now or face violent consequences. Arthur Vance looked around, calculated the odds, and for the first time in his life encountered a situation he couldn't control with money or influence. He pulled the reins violently, turned the horse, and left with the men behind him. But before disappearing through the gate, he shouted something toward the house that made Eleanor's blood freeze. "This isn't over. You will pay for this disobedience, Eleanor. You and the bastard you birthed." Mick had to hold Eleanor, who started trembling uncontrollably. The colonel came back inside the house with a somber expression. He said Arthur had threatened lawsuits, that he was going to use connections to cause trouble, that Eleanor had abandoned a worried family, all the expected lying narrative. But the colonel had made it clear that any legal action would be answered with public revelation of certain inconvenient truths about the lawyer, information the colonel had obtained through contacts in Chicago. Apparently, Arthur had more skeletons in the closet besides seducing poor girls. If you want this story to have a happy ending, leave a comment with a word of strength for people who are fighting to start over. You can't imagine the power your message can have. The stalemate was established. Arthur couldn't force Eleanor to return without exposing secrets that would destroy his reputation. But he also wasn't going to simply forget and move on. He was a small, cruel man who didn't tolerate losing. The colonel advised that Eleanor and Mick stay at the ranch a few more weeks until the situation cooled down, until he was sure Arthur had truly retreated. It was during those weeks at the ranch that surprising things began to happen. The colonel, who had sworn never to get attached to anything again after his son's death, was clearly growing fond of little Theodora. He visited the room every day, spent hours just watching the baby sleep, held her with the care of someone holding fragile treasure. Mrs. Gable commented to Eleanor that it was a miracle, that she never imagined seeing that man of stone smile again, but there he was making funny faces to make the baby laugh. The colonel also began to treat Mick differently, no longer with suspicion or tolerance, but with genuine respect. He offered work for Mick on the ranch, said he needed a good carpenter, would pay a fair wage and give a house within the property. But Mick thanked him and politely refused. Said he wanted to work for himself, earn his own bread, not depend on anyone's kindness, however generous it might be. Wanted to go back to the house up high, fix it completely, turn it into a real home. The colonel understood and respected that. He gave tools, lumber, nails, everything Mick would need to make repairs, gave also 2 months of provisions, laying hens, seeds for a garden, and kept the promise to transfer the deed of the house and the surrounding lands to Mick and Eleanor's names. When he signed the documents at the notary, accompanied by Mrs. Gable as witness, the colonel said he was paying a debt to his dead son, giving other people the chance for a fresh start he hadn't given his own Theodore. It was in December, when Theodora was turning 1 month old, that Eleanor and Mick finally returned to the house on the ridge. But they didn't return alone. They returned as a legally married couple, with a simple ceremony officiated by Reverend Matthews in the ranch chapel, with the Colonel and Mrs. Gable as witnesses. Eleanor wore a simple white dress that the Colonel's wife, deceased 10 years prior, had used at her own wedding. Mick wore a borrowed suit that was a bit loose, but which he carried with moving dignity. The house they found was transformed. The Colonel had sent hands up during the weeks they were down below, doing basic repairs, windows fixed, roof patched, stove clean and working, walls whitewashed. It was still humble, still had a lot of work ahead, but it was a dignified start. Mick worked every day for months, rising before the sun and stopping only when darkness made it impossible to continue. He built furniture, made shelves, fixed what was broken, created what was missing. Eleanor took care of the house and the baby, cooked, cleaned, organized. Little by little, that abandoned structure was transforming into a home. It had simple calico curtains on the windows, wildflowers in ceramic vases on the kitchen table, the smell of fresh bread baking in the stove. It had baby cries filling the rooms, conversations around the fireplace, laughter and plans and hope. The first spring that passed since Eleanor arrived there brought visible transformation. Mick planted a garden in the back, potatoes, carrots, squash, beans, corn, built a coop where the birds the Colonel gave laid eggs every day, repaired the old barn and bought 2 goats that gave milk. It wasn't wealth, but it was honest sustenance earned with sweat and dedication. Eleanor resumed something she had abandoned years ago: writing. She had found paper and ink among the supplies the Colonel sent and began to record everything that happened. Her and Mick's story, the escape, the meeting, the love that grew against all odds. She wrote at night after putting Theodora to sleep, while Mick worked on some carpentry project nearby. She didn't know if anyone besides her would read it someday, but she needed to record it, needed to bear witness that true love existed, that fresh starts were possible, that not everything was lost in this hard world. 2 years after Theodora's birth, Eleanor gave birth to another baby, a boy they named Jack, in honor of the old prisoner who had helped Mick survive the years in jail, keeping his humanity intact. The birth was easier this time, with Mrs. Gable commanding everything with efficiency, with Mick by her side holding Eleanor's hand, with little Theodora waiting curiously outside to meet her little brother. Life continued like that, season after season. Mick began to be known in the region as a skilled carpenter. People came up the ridge to order furniture, doors, windows. He charged a fair price and did honest work, and gradually built a reputation that erased the stains of the unjust past. Eleanor became a reference for pregnant women or those with small children who needed advice, shelter, someone who understood what it was to be rejected and have to start from zero. Colonel Sterling visited once a month, always bringing gifts for the children, always staying for dinner, always leaving with a smile on his face and lightness in his shoulders that didn't exist before. He said that house had stopped being a mausoleum of grief and had become a celebration of life continuing. Mrs. Gable came up whenever some woman in the region needed her, and always stopped by Eleanor and Mick's house, had coffee, talked, left advice and natural remedies. 5 years after that morning, when Eleanor woke up alone and terrified in the abandoned house, she woke up on a winter dawn, with Mick beside her, with 2 children sleeping in the next room, with the smell of coffee being prepared on the stove, with the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she should be. She got up slowly, not to wake Mick, put the shawl over her shoulders, went to the window. The fog covered the ridge as always, but Eleanor had learned to love that fog. It didn't obscure anymore. It protected that piece of the world where love and work had built something solid over ruins of shattered pasts. Eleanor placed her hand on the wood of the window Mick had fixed with such care and thought of everything they had survived to get there. She thought of the father who rejected her and never tried contact. Thought of Arthur Vance, who eventually gave up chasing her when he realized the colonel wasn't going to back down and insisting would expose his own crimes. She learned from Mrs. Gable that Arthur had finally been reported by one of the other girls he had seduced, one who had a family with their own lawyers. The scandal had stained his reputation permanently. It wasn't complete justice, but it was something. Eleanor thought of all the women who, like her, had been deceived, abandoned, judged by a society that placed all the blame on the victims and none on the predators. She had started writing letters to some of them, offering temporary refuge if they needed, offering an ear that didn't judge, offering living proof that it was possible to survive and even find happiness on the other side of destruction. The bedroom door opened slowly, and Mick appeared, hair messy from sleep, beard fuller now, scar on the eyebrow she had learned to love because it was part of his story. He approached from behind, wrapped his arms around her, rested his chin on her shoulder. "Everything all right?" he asked softly. Eleanor nodded, turned within his embrace, looked into the light brown eyes that had been the first thing she saw on that terrifying morning 5 years ago. "Everything's all right," she answered. "More than all right. It's perfect just the way it is." Mick smiled, that rare but genuine smile that was worth more than all the pretty promises in the world. He kissed her forehead, then her lips, and then they went together to prepare coffee before the children woke up and filled the house with the chaotic energy of a happy childhood. Later that day, while Eleanor nursed little Jack and Mick taught Theodora to recognize letters, someone knocked on the door. It was a young girl, no more than 17. Belly pregnant about 5 months, eyes red from crying, carrying a small bundle of belongings. She said Mrs. Gable had given the address, had said that house was a safe place for women who needed refuge. That her name was Amelia, that she had been kicked out of home by her father after being seduced and abandoned by a married merchant, that she had nowhere to go. Eleanor and Mick exchanged just one look, didn't need words. Eleanor got up, went to the door, opened it wide and told Amelia to come in, that she was safe now, that she wasn't alone anymore. The girl entered crying with relief, and Eleanor hugged her with the strength of someone who understood every ounce of that pain, every fragment of that fear. And that was how the house on the ridge, which had been abandoned by tragedy, which had been the refuge of 2 broken hearts, transformed into a sanctuary for all who needed a second chance. Eleanor never became rich, never had an easy life, was never recognized by the society that had rejected her. But she built something more valuable, a chosen family based on true love, a community of women supporting one another, a legacy of compassion that spread silently through the region. Years later, when Eleanor was sitting on the porch with hair starting to grey, surrounded by grandchildren running in the yard, she looked at Mick, working in the barn with their son Jack, now a young man of 20, learning his father's trade. Theodora, married and living on a nearby farm, was arriving up the path bringing a basket of bread. Colonel Sterling had died 3 years before, in peace for the first time in decades, leaving part of the ranch to Mick in his will and the rest to institutions that helped orphan children. Eleanor opened the old notebook where she had recorded the whole story, read the first lines she wrote years ago. She fell asleep alone in an abandoned house high up in the mountains, convinced she would die there with the baby she carried in her womb. She took the pen, dipped it in ink, and wrote the last sentence of the story on the last page of the notebook. But she woke up, and she wasn't alone anymore. And that was just the first of 1,000 times that true love proved it was stronger than fear, stronger than abandonment, stronger than all the judgments of the world. Love didn't save her from all the hardships, didn't make life easy, didn't erase the scars, but it gave something more important, gave a reason to wake up every morning and fight, gave a family that chose to stay, gave a home they built together over the rubble of who they were. And in the end, that was the greatest victory possible. Done. Eleanor closed the notebook slowly, placed it on the shelf next to the other notebooks full of stories of all the women who had passed through that house over the years. Each had her narrative of pain and fresh start. Each had contributed a thread to the complicated tapestry of solidarity they wove together. And all proved the same fundamental truth. No woman is truly alone as long as other women are willing to extend a hand and say, "You are welcome here. You deserve a second chance. You will survive this." The sun was setting behind the mountains, dyeing the fog gold and purple. Mick climbed the porch steps and sat beside Eleanor in the rocking chair he had made for her years ago. They stayed there, hands intertwined, watching the day turn to night, listening to the sounds of family around, knowing they had built something that would last far beyond their own lives. And in the house that had been born of grief, that had witnessed loneliness and fear, that had kept two desperate strangers on a cold night in November, now lived the most beautiful sound old wood can hold. The sound of love that remained, of promises that were kept, of life that chose to bloom even where everyone said nothing would grow. The house on the ridge had finally found its purpose, not as a monument to death, but a stubborn testimony that life always finds a way, especially when two hearts decide to fight together against everything trying to separate them.